a long, long time. People would plan out the activities they're going to engage in. More recently, has been a discipline called strategy. People have put those two things together to call something strategic planning. Unfortunately, those things are not the same, strategy and planning, so just putting them together and calling it strategic planning doesn't help. What most strategic planning is in the world of business has nothing to do with strategy. It's got the word, but it's not. It's a set of activities that the company says it's going to do. We're going to improve customer experience. We're going to open this new plant. We're going to start a new talent development program, a whole list of them, and they all sound good. But the results of all of those are not going to make the company happy because they didn't have a strategy.
So what we saw in terms of like Professor Roger Martin, who's the former dean of Rotman School of Management, he says strategy is not planning, but then that begs the question, what is it? And even before we go into how we can unlock strategy for things like growth and scalability for each of our organizations, I think it helps us to explore what strategy means to each of us, right? So he goes on to say strategy is a set of choices that positions you on a playing field such that you play to win. So it's a theory. It's a theory where, here, this is what will happen. These are the things that we know. We can't prove it in advance. We can't guarantee it. But this is going to be our strategy to win, right? And to me, strategy is a framework that we can use for decision making. It can be a set of guiding principles, and it can be applied as the situation evolves. But I'd love to hear from you. Sally, what do you think?
So very much agree with what you've just said there. I think also strategy has to have that element of some aspiration in it, some sort of real sense of true north, something that builds some excitement and builds some desire from the organisation to want to get on that journey. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I always think a strategy needs to have that engaging element, sets a real kind of direction of travel that everybody can get behind as well. So I think that's always really important for success of a strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Devendra?
I think to me it's a lot of saying no to things. When you sort of decide on strategy and where you want to be, and I kind of like your reference to North Star. I know you said North, but what is your true north? Where do you want to go? What do you actually want to be, and where do you want to be in a certain amount of time? What that requires is a set of choices to be made, and more often than not, you need to be able to say no to a lot of things, because without that, you can't maintain focus to actually get to where you want to be. But it's also about agility, meaning your strategy can be very clearly laid out and very simply laid out, but the choices you make along the way force you to be nimble in terms of how you get there. So it's so I quite like his framing of strategic planning. There's no such thing, and it's two very different things. One really helps you realize on your strategy, but to me, I think the most important part is do you have it in you to be able to say no more often than not, so you can actually stay true what you want to be when you grow up, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lots of stuff well said, I would say. And I mean, first, thanks for having us. So I think that different elements that were called out here already and that very much resonate with my strategy understanding is having a clear vision of what you want to achieve. And then from the many, many different ways you could go about achieving that, really creating clarity on what is, in your view, the important path towards that, ideally the fastest one, and with the biggest return on investment in a sense. And so, yes, it's about choices, right? Being really clear about where you're going to play and also where you're not going to play.
Yeah.
And I think it should, with that, also become a really strong communication tool in a sense to create alignment, to create engagement, especially in very complex environments, in my view.
Yeah. So, sorry. I also agree with sort of the idea of the choices and the decisions, because I think for me it's also strategies about that focus, about all the many things you could do. What are the few things that you really want to focus on, that you really want to emphasize? And with that, I think it also involves, for me, this element of sort of sticking to that. And that's for two reasons. As you said before, you cannot prove in advance that these are the right choices or the right decisions. But everybody will have an opinion about it.
Yeah.
And many people will tell you, no, this is wrong. You should have done that. Or, so everybody has an opinion about this. So I think it's important to stick to it. But at the same time, you also need to balance that, I think, with the ability to adapt. And I think Paul had this slide at the very beginning of the morning today with the trends and these little fluctuations alongside of the trends. So I think it's all about differentiating between those micro fluctuations and applying a bit of a frequency filter to that, but then still being able to respond to the bigger changes in, I don't know, corporate strategy or whatever else there is around you, to be able to adapt potentially your strategy to those bigger things happening around you.
Yeah. And as we kind of flow into the organization piece, right, in terms of what it means for each of us, because I know each of us here have individually made strategic choices and decisions on behalf of our organizations, right? And some of these decisions in the short term might seem unpopular sometimes, but then they're needed for the long-term intent, right? And when each of us make these choices, that also comes in my mind in terms of, does strategy really need someone to represent it, right? Does it need a face, or does it need a person to own it? What do you think, Roman?
I think often what Roger Martin said, we often confuse is sort of planning and strategy. I think the other thing we also often mix up a bit is vision and strategy, and we use them as kind of the same. I think a vision might need a face. We all have these stories about charismatic leaders with their visions changing the world or the company. For a strategy, for me, it's more important for a strategy to eventually embed itself in an organization or in its culture. It may need to have a face in the beginning, but hopefully not for very long. And to give you an example for this, when I joined Novartis in my current role, many people ask me, Roman, you need to come up with a strategy for our software products. And so I got curious and I asked, well, what has the strategy been so far? And then some people said, well, we didn't have one. And others said, we have one, I just don't remember it, but I can point you to it. And I thought this was really interesting. Like, how can this be? And so obviously this strategy has not really been embedded in the organization. And so I wanted to do an experiment in trying a different way of coming up with a strategy. I could do this myself. Would it be a good strategy? I don't know. But I wanted to follow a bit more of an inclusive approach. So I created a small working group, a small team. But then we had a bunch of different sessions really engaging the entire organization in giving us feedback, in ideation sessions, and then we created strawmans for the strategy, went back to the organization, gathered more feedback, and so really co-created a product strategy. And we also used this to have conversations about what is a strategy in the first place? What should it do? Because there were lots of expectations about strategies solving you all your questions on a day-to-day basis. And I think it worked well in the sense of the strategy you have now, it's not mine. It really is ours. Is it the most inspiring strategy? Maybe not. So at the face of it, it probably could be better. But this idea of embedding it a bit more broadly in the organization, I think that worked out quite well. I think there are other ways to do this. You know, you could come up with a strategy in a more central place and then, just invest a lot into the communication and the conversations with the organization. So I'm not saying that this is the way to do it. It's an experiment we did. It was very interesting. And I think, again, as I said, it had this added advantage of being able to have conversations about the purpose of a strategy while working on the strategy itself. And I think that was really nice.
Yeah, I love that idea, right? It creates that engagement, gets everybody on the same page. Everybody feels they own part of it, and they've been involved in shaping that. And I agree with your element of your strategy, of you saying about merging strategy and vision. And I think your strategy is kind of how you're going to get to your vision bit. That's how I sometimes need to separate them in my head a bit. But it's a great approach, like you said. And you can always go back and tweak that up and hone it up, your strategy anyway, can't you? But you've got a good playing field with lots of engaged people, all aligned in the same direction. Sounds great.
I think there's two aspects. I mean, I think I'm intrigued by sort of what both of you were saying, right? But for a strategy to be formed and to be able to be successfully executed on with that approach, right? You need to be confident that the team and the people that you've engaged know what good looks like, or know what that North Star or that end point, end game looks like, right? So I think if you believe in that, and if you believe that you have the people around you to get that, then it's absolutely a fantastic approach, right? And then I think, to Roman, your point about, often what we see is charismatic leaders as the face of strategy, as the face of vision. And sometimes it is somebody sort of saying, well, this is what I believe good looks like, right? And that also works. But for that to work, you have to very quickly make sure that you identify a set of change agents to then realize that. Because if you can't translate that, I think Paul talked about complicated and complex. And the complex pieces, everything you hear around our industry with digital transformation is that the complex piece is the people. Right? The technology is the easier piece to figure out. And same thing. So at the end of the day, who's going to help you realize on your strategy? It's the people. And to get them on board, to get everybody on board, you do need that change agents to start with, is sort of how at least I've approached it.
Yeah, very true. I think strategy normally means also choices, as you said, of not doing things, right? And that's, of course, the hard thing, where you need to take people along. Also really making them understand, why are you not doing certain things? Or why might you not stop certain things or not continue doing things that maybe also created value, right? So it's often also a judgment on where can I create most value. And I think making it clear to people why you take a certain choice, and really involving people also in that decision process, actually, of where to focus and why. That's critical, right? Because this is something that you can fix only very difficultly later on if you haven't had that input also in the beginning.
Absolutely.
I would be curious, Roman, who did you involve actually? The people from the organization who built the products, or also the kind of beneficiaries of your products?
We didn't just limit this to sort of the product management organization. We involved people outside of that too, but we stayed within the informatics organization. Okay. So we didn't go and involve business stakeholders in that. We were thinking about it, but then we thought also, to be really inclusive, this might make too big of a team, or then also would just stretch out the entire process too much than we felt we should afford.
And were there then any learnings, how you involved in the business kind of later on, maybe? So what was your approach for that?
Well, we early on, we found ourselves in a situation where most of the input we got was not about sort of the technical nature of our software products, but it was more about our organization itself, about how we take decisions, how, for example, for investments, how we deliver, how much emphasis we want to give to excellence in operations, for example. And so it was more about us. And at that point, we also felt that is not really something where we do need to involve business stakeholders. I think had we seen more elements about the actual portfolio of our software products, that might have gone a bit of a different way. So also here we try to stay flexible and just see where we go. and then sort of steer our interactions in this way. And that worked quite well. Because I feel if we had planned this all through, including a large number of business stakeholder interactions, and then we come to them and say, here is our draft, it's all about operations and our excellence, this might have been pretty boring for them.
And I also remember, Roman, you mentioned that if they don't know it, then there's an element where you need to be the person selling it to them. You need to be the person convincing it to them. But if they're already in on the strategy, they feel like it's theirs, they own it, they drive it, there's passion in it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also usually when you see a strategy, it's well worded. And at the very end, before publishing a strategy, you try to make it snappy and short. But it also makes it appear simple in a way, because it reads well and it's all nice. And that makes people quickly underestimate the effort that went into it, and be very judgmental about it and have this feeling of, oh, I could do this better. And so what we also saw is by involving people in the process, I think they also learned how hard this is and how difficult it is to, in the end, not have a strategy where you need to read a book about it because all the ideas are in there. But again, the conciseness that you want to have in a strategy, how tough that is. So I think also this element of learning was really nice to see in our engagement sessions.
Yeah, and that reminds me, because when you told me this story before, it reminded me of what GE has done as well. During the Jack Welch era, GE had created a collaboration. It was called Workout, or Change Acceleration Process as well, where they kind of created like created a collaborative approach to strategic development, and that removed all boundaries, whether it be function, geography, people, rank, and they called it boundaryless behavior, right, during strategy development. But then the word strategy, right, sometimes it can be considered glamorous. Everybody looks at strategy and they think, oh, magic is being created, right? Is that always the case? Devendra, your thoughts?
I mean, I think to Roman's point, if you're not involved in the creation of it, right, and it does take foresight, right, in terms of where do you actually want to be over a period of time, and not everybody can see that as quickly, and that's probably where sort of the view of like, well, it sounds either far-fetched or sounds appealing and glamorous to the point you're making. But in reality, I think at the end of the day, our head of strategy and business development at PerkinElmer, who's interestingly both ex-Thermo Fisher and Novartis, used to say the strategy is easy, right? It's what comes after that's extremely hard, because how do you actually realize it? So, but people think about it as what's been articulated very well, to your point, summarizes on a page or on a line or two, and therefore the glamour around it, right? But in reality, what it is as I go back to kind of what I said, it's a set of tough choices that you've made to say you're not going to do something.
And I mean, for me, I sometimes joke even because I feel now strategy is often used as an excuse for a lot of things, or the lack of strategy is used for a lot of things, where I'm often thinking it's not really strategy what people are asking for. And it goes back exactly to what we saw in that video, right? So sometimes people really ask for planning, and but then they will say, oh, we lack a strategy, that's why we cannot move forward. And in fact, they are not really lacking the strategy, right? So I think it's helpful for organizations to be clearer on what is really the strategic element of your organization. And normally that should be summarizable in few slides, right? It's not something extensive. It's really a basic framework that will guide many of the downstream decisions, but it cannot be the answer to all the problems everyone in that organization has. So I think that's why it's important still that you really create alignment on that basic framework, but ideally then it empowers actually everyone in that organization to take own decisions, right, following that strategy, but it cannot be used as an excuse of not taking decisions yourself, in my view. But it's often mixed up, and that can cause confusion.
And I think always being able to come back to that strategy, that element of they're written over here, and then all the planning, everybody's still, but keep keep coming back to that strategy to inform the decision making and keep that strategy alive as well. I think that basic communication, you don't just say it once, you've got to keep reiterating and keep building on it, and that keeps your framework solid, I think. Otherwise there's that drift happens and the planning starts going off and everybody starts having a different view or opinion of it, particularly when it is rolled up quite high, to your point, Roman, as well, I think.
Yeah, I also think there's something like too much glamour for a strategy. And that's when sort of people in the organization struggle to connect to it or to use it to guide their decision making on a day-to-day basis. So I think maybe a little bit of glamour just to be exciting enough. But I think it's important to make sure that it's not too much.
It can also be very conflicting with the day-to-day goals of an organization. You know, I'll give you an example, right? You know, let's say you're taking a new product to market, and you decide that you're only going to focus on top 50 biopharmaceutical companies. That's just hypothetically, that's your strategy, right? But to achieve that can take a ton of work, you know, a ton of investment, sustained engagement, a lot of thought, right? And then you've got a competing goal that says, well, you're in a product company, in a public corporation, you've got to hit your quarterly P&L goals. And so along comes a Chevron or an Exxon or somebody, and then you say, sure, but I can actually go win business there. And you have to make that decision of saying, no, but this is what's true, staying true to the strategy means. And so you've got to kind of make the trade-offs and or decide, does that actually fit in your strategy? Does your strategy have to adapt and change because what you're getting in terms of market signals is different, right? So it can actually be in conflict of your short term.
So is this where you also need to know where you say no to the strategy comes into play, which you were mentioning earlier?
I personally feel so. I think you know, being able to realize on a certain big picture vision means that you make those choices and say no to something, even if it's painful in the short term.
Right.
And I think that's the balance that Roman mentioned earlier about managing the fluctuations of change and you staying true to your strategy, and perhaps some really big pivot points where you have to completely switch strategy and you have to read the market and actually move away. I think, that's they're the really tough choices to make.
Yeah.
And
Any thoughts from, I don't know if you want to get folks engaged in the discussion.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I'm Mehdi from Zifo. Thank you. Very interesting. I would like to know how do you measure the success factor of your growth strategy, and if you have any metrics or KPI to measure the performance of those metrics?
Do you want to go first, or?
No, go for it. I was busy looking around.
I think from a business.
Am I audible?
Yeah. Yep. You are. I think from a business lens, it can be fairly. It can be difficult in the short term, as I mentioned, sort of because you could have certain big picture goals. What you kind of want to do, so Thermo Fisher has a philosophy and an approach that it takes where it calls something as targets to improve. So you're not actually necessarily measuring KPIs as saying directionally what are your indicators on a quarterly basis that would validate that either you're on the right path or not. And so that's our approach at Thermo Fisher. But you don't necessarily need hard metrics, but you do need to say that, okay, there's these things that I'm going to see, these sets of changes that I believe are going to play out in a certain way over a certain period of time. And are you seeing those? And if yes, then you're saying, yes, it's working. And then there absolutely are going to be hard financial numbers at the end of the day, especially if you're a product company, right?
And I think when we look at the definition phase, and when we look at how do we bring strategy together as a group, and we also look at how do we start making decisions based on whatever we have defined as strategy, I think it also then plays into the activation phase or the implementation phase of how are you going to implement your strategy, right? I was reading this book, Good to Great by Jim Collins recently, and there's a very interesting concept there about confronting the brutal facts, right? And yet you still have faith, because this book talks about how companies make the leap from being good to achieving greatness. And this also, when you confront the brutal facts, it emphasizes the importance of having realism along with optimism in your strategy, right? And so that brings me to what could be some of the common pitfalls, or could be some of the common pitfalls or kind of misconceptions when you're in this phase about strategy implementation or activation. Sally, would you like to share?
So are you're talking about some of the, it's kind of like looking in the dusty corners almost, and speaking about the unspoken a little, and addressing that before you start on a new strategy. And I think an example that we talked about, Suchi, when we met, I was talking about a few years back in my career when I went back from tech back into an R&D portfolio role, strategy and portfolio role, was the element of the strategy was we needed to narrow down our assets we were working, spread way too thin, couldn't prioritize, we were just working on everything. Sounds really, really simple, exactly. We need to, it makes good common sense. But actually when you start unpicking that apart a bit, it's that element of not everybody was aligned to that same goal, really. Everybody's got their little babies, that they've grown them for such a long time. They're so personally invested in them. So actually, how do you get everybody with their own little babies to line them up and say, which ones do we want to invest in? Which ones do we want to grow and mature? And which ones do we, have to stop? And that's a really, in an ideal world, the strategy sounds great. Everybody could go, yeah, I agree with that strategy. But when you turn around and say, that might mean you need to stop what you're doing. It's a very human, and particularly with science, and researchers are very, very invested in that. But I think unless you bring everybody together again, go back to Roman's point about what role they play in that, to actually see the greater good and be able to give up their babies to help grow another baby instead and invest in that one. And it was a really interesting learning for me, because from the outside, that's really easy, that one, we must be able to compare these things, put a framework in place, but actually the huge human element. And it wasn't until we started really going into those dusty corners and really having those conversations and speaking the unspoken, really, and saying, actually, you're going to have to stop, and you're going to have to do, it's going to be really hard. It is for the greater good, and trying to help people on that journey. So,
I think actually another pitfall is related to the question we just had before about metrics. I think we all want to measure things, and we want to measure our progress. But I think all of you probably also know how difficult it is to come up with the right types of metrics. And I think the pitfall here is in then being so desperate in having a metric that you end up having the wrong one. And then that metric becomes the goal.
Yeah.
And rather than the actual outcomes you wanted to achieve. If there isn't like a super great match between the two, you may optimize for something you didn't even want to. And so I think that is also really dangerous when you really want to make things measurable in your strategy, in finding the right types of measurables.
I think
just what you say, because I had a similar thought even also when I asked you about, how then to involve, in a sense, the people who should benefit from your strategy. And that's, I think, ways important, right? Because in the end, you want to also continuously monitor, is your strategy now really creating the value that you intended to create with it? And it's something that's quite hard to do, exactly because it's hard to define measurables. I think there's also an emotional element. I think you can also fall in love with your strategy in a sense, right? And just see the good stuff of it. And kind of get the voices that you like to hear, but really then also getting the diverse kind of really honest also look at your strategy, how well you're doing, and maybe also from really challenge your own strategies regularly is really important, I think.
I think
I know someone had.
I think
Michael.
2 or 3 people. Yeah.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. Hi, Arvind from UCB. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's quite insightful, to be honest. I have actually 2 questions. One, strategy is generally perceived as something which is a top-down approach where it comes from above. How much is it big difference does it make when it's more collaborative, that you form the strategy where it's more bottom-up than compared to top-down? And secondly, in terms of the alignment or realignment of your strategy when there is a disruption, like the best example would be the pandemic, which happened like a couple of years ago. But it doesn't have to be negative as well, right? It could be a positive disruption like artificial intelligence, for instance. How do you formulate your strategy or reformulate that when there is a disruption that comes into place? So these are the 2 questions that I had.
I'm happy to go first. I think great questions. I mean, on the top down versus bottom up, right? Bottom up only works, in my opinion, if it is aligned to sort of a top down corporate strategy still. Like you still need, so for example, at Thermo Fisher, again, I'll take a current example, right? Somebody could come up and say, we're 120,000 people. We do almost everything that pharma companies do in many ways. We could come up and say, and I had this situation 2 weeks ago where a company approached us and said, here's what we're doing, and we built this platform, and would you like to collaborate and work with us? And in theory, it sounded great. They're also looking for some investment. And Thermo Fisher does investments in multiple ways, including having now a corporate ventures arm and a fund with Flagship. So we said, on the surface, this looks interesting, right? So bottoms up, it could look like, this is actually going to help. Top down, it was very clear the minute I went to our chief strategy officer and said, how do you think about this, right? And he's like, well, they actually have a molecule candidate, and that's in conflict to a company strategy where we've decided that, if we want to enable science, we will never invest in companies like that and try to become a part of that, because then we start to compete with our customers. And that's very clearly sort of not something what we want to do. So I think, if there are other examples where bottoms up, you could be doing something that's in support of a corporate strategy, and that works, right? Is sort of my first. And your second question, I'm sorry.
It was related to the disruptions.
So I think to disruption, I'll give you an example of where bottoms up does work again. I went into Thermo Fisher roughly 3 years ago, right smack in the middle of the pandemic. And what Thermo Fisher, somebody, not necessarily top down, recognized as an opportunity was say, hey, we could play into this in 2 ways. What the world needs is testing, and it's going to need vaccines to get out there fairly quickly, right? And to enable the latter, we do need to make sure that we can actually support our customers that are going to be manufacturing these vaccines and need the manufacturing set up to scale in order to deliver this as quickly as possible. And in support of that, Thermo Fisher, there was a VP who said, well, we're going to need to make an investment. And literally on a weekly basis, our corporate capitals committee was approving hundreds of millions of dollars in capital investments, probably unheard of, in the belief that, yes, this is the right strategy to actually support our partners, whether that's Pfizer, Moderna, or whoever else. And so that is an example of kind of bottoms up. Somebody came and said, here's why I do it, and here's what it'll support. And it's still aligned to us enabling science, right? So it's to your point, it doesn't have to be negative. It can be a lot of positive.
And if you look at disruption, I think there's also a lot of negative connotation associated with the word disruption sometimes. So let me sprinkle some positivity and call it alignment, right? Because if you take the fundamentals of how a business works, right? It could be what are the sources that you have for your value creation, what is your basis of competition that you have, what are also the drivers of the costs to deliver it. Like Angelica, you were mentioning, it also refers back to what is the return I'm going to get if I'm going to be investing on a lot of these different actions when it comes to strategy, right? So if you're if you're going to be taking a look at all of that, and let's call it alignment rather, right? And you have to get your organization aligned and your strategy coherent to all of the different business units, then how would you go about executing that?
Yeah, and I mean, as you saw, right, so I'm part of Roche Pharma Research Early Development, and there I would say as an informatics unit, you always have the challenge, how do you explain and justify the investments that go into that space? And I think ideally strategy can really help you, right, because it clearly communicates this is what we contribute in terms of value, and this is also where we really want to play strongly to drive research, for example. It's at the same time also very hard because, as we heard, right, it also means you need to be clear on many areas where you will not play in a sense. And of course, in research, it's always a bet. You really, really don't know, right? So, and that's why, on the one hand, I mean, it was a good question about how much bottom up, how much top down, right? So for me, I also agree. Bottom up in these cases cannot really work because you will have so many opinions that you cannot create that clarity, right? At the same time, I think it's really important that you make sure you have diverse opinions that kind of get incorporated and ideally already involve the right people that can then also become a change agent, for example. And in our case, we just also went over already a long period, right, of being an organization that was very customer-centric, for example. So we built a lot of customized, highly customized, tailored solutions for different parts of the pharma research value chain. And at some point we realized, hey, that is not scalable, right? So because you really have a high degree of fragmentation and it's really hard then to really continuously justify additional investments for very specific use cases. And the way we went about that was really kind of drastically shifting also then the strategic focus and saying instead of now us being the organization who builds these customized tools, we really align on common capabilities and we are going to build platforms then that can be used across different areas. And actually, though, it sounds kind of obvious, I would say, especially for people in informatics. But for the stakeholders at the business side, that was not obvious at all, right? So actually, they went through a really painful also period of rejection and also really kind of challenging that strategy because, of course, from their side, they were really losing something in terms of really customized and personal kind of support. And that goes back then, how do you really set such a change up in a way that it, at least you can really clearly explain why you need to do it. And going back to also a data-driven, in a sense, explanation is really important, but also really making sure that, I would say on the top level at least, it's really clear why that change needs to happen so that you can then bring in the bigger organizations with it. At least that's what we learned, but it's still a very painful process. And I think it cannot be underestimated how long it needs also then to execute on such a strategy simply because it's not just now a plan to, do, but you need to continuously monitor how well do you progress, are the decisions you're taking the right ones, and adapting as you go.
What would you think helped those stakeholders who were really frustrated, what helped them the most to overcome that frustration?
I think on the one hand, it is really the big picture, right? And I mean, trying to take them out of from their individual perspective of the world, in a sense, and showing the bigger picture. I think that is one thing that we try to do a lot. It's still tough, right? Because everyone has their own priorities and you want to deliver on their priorities. So I think trying to foster a mindset of we succeed together, I think. So this mindset and cultural element is really important, trying to invest in that. And also, I think really investing in building up trustful relationships is really important, right? That there is an element of, yes, we are experts in a certain space and we really design a strategy with all the inside and outside knowledge we have and really I mean, having a continuous communication strategy around that strategy then is really important.
A bit unfair question, right? You know where the skeletons in the closet are.
Yeah, well, and everyone has them, right? So.
And that's a very, very interesting point, Angelica, because you mentioned about if you're going to be doing a lot of things internally, then scalability also becomes a question, right? And there is a myth that sometimes people think strategy is only limited to being an internal task. And internally within the organization, that's all that we should look at. Resources, costs, anything that we do, it should only be internal, right? But most of the successful strategies that we see, they're all about taking quick action, right? Showing that agility. And how do you also involve external collaborators? How do you involve partnerships? What do you do when you have to make any decision that involves growth in mind and scalability in mind? And I know each of you have made these decisions, right? So how important are strategic partnerships and collaborations, and how would you approach them when you're thinking about scalable growth?
I can, shall I?
Yeah, go for it, Sally.
Because I think it kind of, builds a little bit on the conversations earlier. So the elements of building things up from the bottom a little and getting that engagement always takes it takes more time than we think it will, and we often rush that stage. And I think that exactly to that point as well, about taking the time to think about who are the right partners, external, what are the insights we need to get from the outside world as well. Because I agree, and certainly in a big company like GSK, sometimes we think we know it all already, but know-it-alls, but actually what are the insights out there in other industries, and making sure we bring those in. And I think the biggest kind of learning of these is stopping for a moment to take the time to really think and design better, creates that engagement, allows. So I was going to add to the conversation earlier just to say, never underestimate how long it might take. Factor that into your project plan, that engagement time and that setup time to really, because otherwise you lose it later anyway, because you have to stop, get everybody else back on board if you move too quickly and don't take everybody with you. So it's that exploratory phase is so important with your partners, externally, internally, and I think we rush that and then bid to do things quickly. So you mentioned we do strategy quickly. I'd probably challenge that a little and say we should be doing it thoughtfully. And if we can do it quickly, great. But ultimately, if you save time early, it just catches you up later and slows you down later. It's going to be my add to that.
I think partners also can be extremely valuable in communicating or helping with the pain of not doing something, right? Because I think normally the problem doesn't go away just because in your strategy it says we are not doing it anymore. And I think also thinking from the other side, in a sense, what are the people who you communicate now to that you are not doing something? How can you still build up a strong partner network so that even if you're not doing something, there is still a solution for what is needed? I think is a critical element also that can complement your strategy and then even help the buy-in because people don't feel left alone.
Yeah, I also think apart from sort of the execution where you might want to you work with partners, I think also having external partners around just to hold your own organization accountable to that strategy that you set, I think can also be super valuable. You don't want to do that all internally. You want sort of your surroundings to know about your strategy so they can help holding yourself accountable to that.
Questions maybe, or
a couple of hands up there.
Yeah, sorry, I had a question here.
Yeah.
Hi, Carl Latham from Ontoforce. Thank you for sharing your insights so far. I apologize, I'm going to have to ask you a question about Gen AI as a real world example from a strategic standpoint. So how do you tackle the challenge of developing a strategy for a disruptive technology that comes along where there might be quite unrealistic expectations from your senior leadership team on the potential and how to utilize the technology?
And I
was gonna borrow a word, thoughtfully.
yeah, and I was going to say, I think we're undergoing that challenge right now at GSK, because exactly that point when we're a huge company, lots of, we have a lot of technology platforms. We're kind of quite stuck with our roots in the ground sometimes. But the ask from our scientists is, look at this great thing I've seen. And we are getting that pressure from leadership now. What are we doing in Gen AI? What are we doing? What's our strategy going to be? So I think we're still doing some of that thinking. We're doing some experiments, and I think we work in agile delivery in the same way that Claire and Mary described very well earlier as well. So trying to do those experiments to show what is possible and what isn't, and trying to do that quickly, but doing that on small scale. But yeah, we definitely don't have, I think for a large company, it's tricky right now. We are literally getting those questions like last week. What's our strategy? What are we doing? So yeah, it's hard. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I think with Gen AI, there's a ton of excitement, but there's also a ton of hype. And sort of, if you think about the Gartner hype cycle, we're somewhere going through that right now to really understand what that impact actually is going to be, right? I don't think it's known. I don't know whether there have been technologies that have disrupted us that quickly in the past, right? It does take time to play out. I mean, strategically, I think you have to be very clear what you're going to try and do and what you're not going to try and do with it, right? And so, as an example, I think within Thermo Fisher, what we did quickly about it was formed a center of excellence and said, you're going to go out and actually solicit broadly, crowdsource ideas to say, where do we think we can really apply this, right? So to your point again of kind of how do you engage people and bring in ideas, and where do you then score it and say, but show that you can actually move through that fairly quickly. And what we've done in a very few short months actually said there are specific things that we do where we believe the technology can have very quick impact. Example could be translations of documents from one language to another. And that's an area where we've actually said, yep, let's deploy it at scale. And there could be other areas where you don't quite know, and I think you need to go through a full process and just examples, right? So, but it's ongoing. It's ongoing.
Yeah, the company like Roche, I would say also the challenges with topics like that, right? Suddenly everyone wants to do it.
Yeah.
And then you have multiple places and everyone has a great idea and everything. And on a company perspective, that is really not helping, I would say. So I think there's on the one hand, the element again in that areas to have really strong partner kind of discussions and on the one hand clarifying who is best positioned to drive what of this whole bigger topic. And I would agree it should always be kind of driven from concrete use cases where you have at least a strong indication that it can really make a difference and go from there in really trying to sort out now what does each of the kind of organizational partners need to contribute to make it happen, and also where can we bring in external partners to really speed up, right? Because until we build up all the internal knowledge, that is also a lengthy process. So especially in these very early phases, it's super important to have the right external partners, I think, defined and identified.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe one more piece, right, is I think if you go back and as Paul said, right, we've spent, perhaps some of us have spent far too much time in the industry, right? As you go back 2+ decades, right, a lot of what happened in the cheminformatics, small molecule infrastructure that you're in some ways living and untangling, right? Because a lot of systems, bespoke systems got built over the years where it's similar in some ways and different in that with technologies like Gen AI, there's a big question on sort of when data does go in, who does it belong to? What's the provenance of that, right? So lawyers are going to have a field day with, when you think about sort of whose patent is it? Where did it actually come from? And so I think companies have learned from what we've done over the last 2+ decades to be much more deliberate and thoughtful in approaching Gen AI than perhaps previously, with new technologies.
There's one thought I can add maybe, and that is, I mean, first of all, I agree, it's new, and I think the probably only real strategy you can have is to explore and understand. And I think here it's also, first of all, identifying use cases, but then I think it's also important for us to really also understand the risks, especially if we want to use Gen AI to drive decision making, like what are the situations where you can trust it enough, and where is that maybe too risky? So I think there's a lot of learning that we still have to do to fully understand that technology, or to at least decently understand the technology, to really start formulating more specific strategies around it. At least that's my feeling.
Any guesses on which firms are actually the last to adopt Gen AI? No, I mean, lawyers. Just ask a law firm and they will say our strategy is actually not to explore Gen AI, right, in the short term, because of the complications around sort of what happens to the content.
Makes sense.
Any other? Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Coming back to the collaboration approach to define a strategy, I very much appreciate the thoughts in that direction, but I can imagine it's most likely difficult to identify the right people to involve. Internally, externally, we had already a word on, but I can imagine if you talk to a CFO, he might have a completely different opinion than a CDO when it comes to defining strategy. Any thoughts on that?
First of all, yes, they will have different ideas, they will have different perspectives, and in a way that's exactly what you want as well. You want to hear those different perspectives. I think the challenge is just in how much space do you give those opinions? How can you still somehow coach the direction a strategy might take? So I think, hearing those perspectives is super important, giving them a voice. But then I think that the big challenge is still having some sort of direction. I also think to that question that we were asked before about, when to do top down and when bottom up, I think it also depends a little bit on how much of maybe a direction change you want to have with that strategy. I think strategy is all about aligning an organization to a certain direction. And I would say the more you want to change direction, the more you want to sort of have an inflection, maybe the more top down you should go. If it's more about surfacing the ideas from the entire or broader organization and coalescing them into something coherent, then maybe go with a bottom-up approach. But I would say, yes, you should be happy to surface those different perspectives from a CFO, from a CEO, and whoever else, and then somehow still manage to massage it down to something tangible.
I mean, I think one way to think about it is, right, as much as it is a set of choices, there's also an and in there, right? So just because it's a CFO and a CDO or a CEO doesn't mean that it's totally independent, like three different things. It can be, we want to be the number one in a certain market and be able to deliver X% profitability, right? And that's an and so you do have to respect both those things because they're both important in some ways, right?
Any other question?
So maybe quickly, because I know we have time. So the vendor mentioned, for example, that strategy is easy, and I will argue that strategy is very easy because it's just doing the right thing. Right? So the question is then when do you do the right thing? But my question is actually more, so obviously we have a strategy, everybody has a strategy somewhere, and usually it's top down, because I don't actually believe that. I think it's very challenging to bottom up. I think it's almost impossible because you could never have the same strategy bottom up. What about the people who will never be involved in strategy, right? That on strategic initiatives. So most of our strategy will actually only be involving, say, often 20, 30% of our people in the team. The rest will be working on maintaining the systems, doing things that are not necessarily aligned. How do you motivate them? Or do you think everybody should be behind the strategy? Is it something everybody should take the training, go to the town halls or whatever we have, and spend time on? Or is it okay that this is only an initiative for, say, 20% of your workforce?
And I think this is a difference between vision and strategy question in a way, because, there's always the people who keep our lights on, ensure that our day-to-day happens well and quality on spec, all that kind of stuff. But I think that element, the actual, the kind of more strategic shifts we might be making, but actually engaging everybody in that vision piece of actually the why they come to work and what they do, working for a big company like GSK, sometimes people can feel a very long way away from actual patients, but that is that constant selling of the, you know, our vision to provide medicines and a really strong messaging that goes to everybody in the organisation. Some of the strategies on how we get there, to your point, might only influence a certain proportion, but ultimately everybody's driving for the same thing. So I think it's about making sure that vision piece is really strong. So even if you're not on the most exciting new Gen I experiment, you fully understand the value of everything you do every day makes a difference. And it's just that I see that a lot, is that reiteration of messaging as to why what you do is important, whether you are, you know, just, you know, working on our help desks or whatever that might be.
And oh, sorry, Angelica.
Yeah, just so I mean, I would actually very much agree with Sally. So if you have, you know, your strategy should clarify how much do you invest, for example, in the daily operations. And with that, people should also have clarity. If they do operations, how much are they aligned to the strategy in a sense? Because otherwise maybe a change is ahead, right, that they need to get prepared for. So I think if you have a strategy that really 80% of your organization doesn't feel connected to, then something is wrong, right? Then maybe you would need to revisit, because it will really be hard to create any kind of organizational unity behind that strategy. There will be a two-class, in a sense, organization that I think is not healthy typically.
I can just second that, because I had a similar feeling, and that's on the one side, you're right. Maybe not every 100% of the organizations involved in those strategic initiatives, but everybody should understand why these are in our focus, and B, they should understand how can they contribute. And sometimes that contribution might be as simple as not doing something, right? Not having their own initiative created and struggling for investment, or maybe optimizing for some cost or resources such that they can be moved over to those strategic initiatives. Whatever it is, I think everybody should have an understanding of how they can contribute to whatever is in the strategy. I also feel very strongly about this.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably about not making the strategy too sexy and special looking, that people can't associate with what they do on a day-to-day basis with that direction of travel. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, as a wrapper, right? I wanted to, if all of us here in this room had to avoid the planning trap and rather rewire their thinking into a strategic thinking rather than a planning only mindset, what is the one piece of advice you would give individuals and organizations to unlock a strategic mindset?
I would say if you have an element in your strategy where you can imagine an end date, then it's probably more a planning element rather than a strategy element. So for me, that is a telltale sign is, can this be completed? And if the answer is yes, then maybe you should rephrase it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would probably almost go slightly in the opposite direction. I mean, I think to me, having clarity on the outcomes you're looking for, right? Directionally, not precisely, but I think what Roman's referring to is precise outcomes by end dates, but directionally, where do you want to go? Sort of having that North Star is really important, because having worked with Jens at Merck and other companies, what I find is that when you translate and go from strategy to execution, people very quickly get caught up in the trap of, this is the process to follow, these are the activities to do. And you lose sight of the outcome, and then you sort of wonder, to your point about wrong KPIs, why haven't we actually realized on the strategy and the outcomes? Because you actually lost sight of it. So what I would encourage people to do is really sort of, step back every now and then and kind of see, are you directionally heading in the right direction? Do you need a Waze GPS turn-by-turn map, or do you need to know I'm going in this direction?
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to add about the stepping back and always doing that check-in on your strategy and checking you're going. No, that's fine, because I was going to add to it from as well from, it's gone out my head now. Yeah, come back to me. It's gone out my head as we're sitting up here. That's all right.
Angelica, what advice would you?
Yeah, I was thinking it's a kind of tough question. So I would say maybe really start with thinking about what not to do, right? Really building this not to do list instead of just getting lost in all the activities that you are planning somewhat to do, and always thinking about the things that you are doing. How does that link back, right, to the bigger vision that you want to achieve? And it's, stepping back, I think, in the end.
I know what I was going to say.
Go for it.
I was going to say that the journey isn't set, actually, as well, from the point of view of it is a strategy. There's still time to change and replan and redo it. And it's that point of coming back to check in. So it's not actually defined exactly what's going to happen every week for the next 3 years or whatever date. There's still space to change and move within it and try different things as well.
And it'll be lovely to take these conversations into lunch, which is where I guess we're all headed. Unless, please. Yes.
Round of applause, everybody, please.